Have you ever witnessed someone absolutely drunk on their own power, completely unaware that the person they are humiliating holds the key to their entire future? There is nothing more satisfying than the cold, hard slap of karma, especially when it arrives wrapped in a black judicial robe. This is the true story of Judge Audra Voss, a respected magistrate who stopped for gas in sweatpants only to be profiled, harassed, and unlawfully arrested by two arrogant deputies. They thought they were teaching a nobody a lesson. They had no idea that they would soon be walking into a courtroom begging for their careers. Let us dive into the ultimate story of justice served. The dashboard clock of the silver sedan glowed as Judge Audra Voss exhaled a long, heavy breath, rubbing the bridge of her nose while the dark, empty stretch of Route 9 rolled endlessly past her windshield. She was exhausted. It had been a grueling judicial conference in the state capitol, filled with endless panels on sentencing reform and constitutional rights. Now all she wanted was the comfort of her own bed. She was not dressed like the Honorable Judge Voss. She had traded her tailored suits and pearls for an oversized gray university hoodie, worn-out black yoga pants, and a pair of scuffed running shoes. Her hair, usually pinned in a neat professional bun, was pulled back in a messy, careless ponytail. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another tired traveler pushing through the graveyard shift. As the fuel light chimed an obnoxious warning on her dash, Judge Voss pulled off the highway and coasted into a dilapidated Texaco gas station. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting a sickly yellow glow over the cracked concrete. It was completely deserted. She stepped out into the crisp, biting air, shivering slightly as she swiped her credit card and grabbed the cold metal of the fuel nozzle. The rhythmic clicking of the gas pumping was the only sound in the dead of night until the low, predatory rumble of a V8 engine shattered the silence. A white and green Oak Haven County Sheriff's cruiser slithered into the station lot. It did not pull up to a pump. Instead, it circled her sedan slowly, like a shark inspecting a raft, before jerking to a halt at a harsh angle, deliberately blocking her car in. Deputy Brock Hollister stepped out of the driver's side. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s, with a tight buzz cut and an arrogant swagger that practically radiated off him. His partner, Deputy Ellis Quinn, a younger, nervous-looking recruit who seemed eager to please, mirrored his movements from the passenger side. "Evening," Hollister said, his voice dripping with forced, mocking politeness. He rested his hand casually on his utility belt right near his sidearm. "Good evening, officers," Judge Voss replied smoothly. Her voice was steady, refined by years of demanding order in chaotic courtrooms. She did not flinch. She did not break eye contact. "Bit late to be out driving around this part of town, is it not?" Hollister asked, stepping closer. His eyes roved over her casual clothes, his upper lip curling into a faint, dismissive sneer. He had already made up his mind about who she was. "Just passing through," Judge Voss said, turning her attention back to the pump. "Heading home." "Home where?" Hollister pressed, stepping into her personal space. The smell of stale coffee and chewing tobacco wafted off his uniform. Judge Voss paused. Her legal mind instantly categorized the interaction. This was a consensual encounter, bordering on an investigatory stop without reasonable suspicion. "I live in the city. Just need a tank of gas." "Let me see some ID," Hollister demanded. Dropping the polite act entirely, Judge Voss calmly replaced the nozzle onto the pump and turned to face him fully. "Am I suspected of committing a crime, Deputy?" Hollister chuckled, glancing back at Quinn. "We got a lawyer here, Ellis. You hear that?" He turned back to Judge Voss, his expression hardening into cold authority. "We have had some reports of break-ins in the residential area a few miles back. You match the description. Now hand over your ID." It was a blatant lie. Judge Voss knew the local dispatch codes. Her scanner app had been quiet the entire drive. Furthermore, she knew her rights. She was not driving. She was pumping gas. "Unless you have reasonable, articulable suspicion that I have committed, am committing, or am about to commit a crime, I am not required to provide identification under state law while simply standing at a gas station, Judge Voss stated. Her tone was firm, educational, yet entirely unthreatening. Hollister's face flushed a deep, ugly red. His authority was being challenged by a woman in sweatpants, and his fragile ego could not handle the bruising. "Listen to me very carefully," Hollister snarled, closing the distance until he was inches from her face. "You are going to give me your ID, and then my partner is going to search your vehicle, or you are going to be in a world of trouble." "You do not have my consent to search my vehicle," Judge Voss said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm register. "And if you continue to detain me without cause, you will be violating my Fourth Amendment rights." Hollister snapped. He lunged forward, grabbing Judge Voss's right wrist with bruising force, yanking her arm painfully behind her back. "Stop resisting! Stop resisting!" he bellowed, manufactured panic in his voice, performing for the dashboard camera of his cruiser. Judge Voss did not struggle. She went completely limp, offering zero physical resistance, though the pain in her shoulder flared intensely. "I am not resisting," she said clearly, ensuring the microphone on his lapel caught every syllable. "I am complying. You are making an unlawful arrest." "Shut up!" Hollister spat, slamming her face first into the trunk of her own car. The cold metal shocked her cheek. Quinn rushed over, hastily unclipping his handcuffs. "Brock, you sure about this?" Quinn muttered hesitantly, his eyes darting around the empty lot. "Slap the cuffs on her, Ellis," Hollister barked. The cold steel bracelets clamped down aggressively on Judge Voss's wrists, biting into her skin as they clicked tighter than necessary. As they roughly dragged her toward the back of the cruiser, Judge Voss made a conscious, strategic decision. The easiest thing to do would be to scream her title. "Do you know who I am? I am Judge Audra Voss." But Judge Voss was a woman of principle. If these deputies were willing to assault and kidnap a citizen over a bruised ego simply because they thought she lacked power, they were a danger to the public. If she played the judge card now, they would backtrack, apologize, and go back to terrorizing vulnerable people. No, they needed to hang themselves with their own rope, and Judge Voss was more than willing to provide the slack. The ride to the Oak Haven County precinct was suffocating. The hard plastic seat of the cruiser offered no support for Judge Voss's awkwardly pinned arms, and the handcuffs cut off the circulation to her fingers, leaving them numb and tingling. In the front seat, Hollister and Quinn laughed. The adrenaline of their power trip made them giddy. "Think she knows the law?" Hollister sneered, adjusting the rearview mirror to glare at Judge Voss. "You learn those big words watching Law and Order, sweetheart? Let us see how smart you feel sitting in a concrete box until morning." Judge Voss remained dead silent, staring out the barred window at the passing streetlights. She mentally began drafting the civil rights lawsuit, the internal affairs complaint, and the exact speech she was going to deliver from the bench. When they hauled her into the precinct, the bright, sterile lights of the booking area were blinding. Sergeant Maddox, a tired-looking veteran officer, was manning the desk. He looked up, raising an eyebrow at the sight of the woman in the hoodie being frog-marched by two deputies. "What do we have here, Hollister?" Sergeant Maddox sighed, pulling a booking slip from a tray. "Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, refusal to identify, possible suspect in the Oakwood burglaries." Hollister rattled off proudly, shoving Judge Voss toward the counter. "Name?" Maddox asked, looking at Judge Voss. Judge Voss lifted her chin. "Audra Voss." Maddox typed the name into the system. "Address?" Judge Voss gave her address, a property located in the wealthy gated enclave of the neighboring district. Maddox paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He looked at the address, then at Judge Voss's scuffed shoes and messy hair, clearly not connecting the dots between the upscale neighborhood and the disheveled woman before him. "Take her belongings and put her in holding cell 3, Maddox instructed, stamping the paperwork. "We will run her prints and let the morning shift sort out the burglary charges." They confiscated her phone, her keys, and her wallet. Hollister did not even bother opening her wallet to look at her ID. He simply tossed it into a manila evidence envelope, completely missing the silver judicial badge and the State Bar Association card tucked inside. It was a staggering display of incompetence. Judge Voss was led down a sterile, bleach-smelling hallway and shoved into a small, cold holding cell. The heavy iron door clanged shut with a terrifying finality. The lock engaged. She was alone. Sitting on the rigid metal bench, Judge Voss rubbed her bruised wrists, the red welts already beginning to purple. She spent the next period sitting in the freezing cell, observing the agonizingly slow passage of time. She did not sleep. She sat in the stillness, experiencing exactly what the defendants in her courtroom felt every day. The helplessness, the cold, the complete stripping of human dignity at the hands of the state. It fueled a righteous, icy fire in her chest. The heavy door to the cell block creaked open. A young female detention officer walked up to the bars of cell 3, holding a clipboard. She looked down at her notes, then up at Judge Voss, her eyes widening in sudden, sheer panic. The night shift had not looked at her wallet, but the morning shift had finally processed her belongings. "Mom?" The officer stammered, her voice trembling. She fumbled violently with the keys to the cell. "Judge Voss?" Judge Voss stood up slowly, her joints popping from the cold. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her oversized hoodie with agonizing deliberation. "Yes, officer." The door swung open. "I am so sorry, Your Honor. Your husband Barrett is here. He just posted your bail. There has been a massive misunderstanding. The watch commander is on his way down right now." "Save it," Judge Voss interrupted, her voice sharp as cracked glass. She stepped out of the cell. "I want my personal effects immediately." "Yes, ma'am, right this way." As Judge Voss walked back into the booking area, the atmosphere had shifted from bored bureaucratic routine to absolute undeniable terror. Sergeant Maddox was standing at attention, sweating profusely. A police captain was hurriedly buttoning his uniform collar as he rushed out of his office, but Hollister and Quinn were nowhere to be seen. Their shift had ended. They had gone home to sleep, completely oblivious to the catastrophic storm they had just unleashed. Judge Voss's husband, Barrett, a prominent corporate litigator, was pacing furiously in the lobby. When he saw Judge Voss, bruised, disheveled, but radiating an aura of lethal calm, he rushed forward, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. "Are you all right?" he whispered, his eyes flashing with anger as he noticed her wrists. "I am going to sue this department into the bedrock." "I am fine, Barrett," Judge Voss said softly, leaning into him for just a second before pulling back, her posture rigid. She turned to look at the terrified captain. "Your Honor, please," the captain began, holding his hands up placatingly. If you had known I was a judge, I would have been treated with respect." Judge Voss cut him off, her voice echoing through the quiet lobby. "But because your deputies thought I was a civilian without power, they assaulted me, violated my constitutional rights, and falsified police reports. That is exactly what I will be addressing today. Your Honor, we can handle Deputies Hollister and Quinn internally." "Oh, you will not have to," Judge Voss said, a dangerous razor-thin smile touching her lips. "Tell Deputies Hollister and Quinn to ensure they are on time for their evidentiary hearing at the district courthouse. I despise tardiness." The captain's face drained of all color. He realized, in that sickening moment, exactly which case Judge Voss was scheduled to hear that day. Judge Voss turned and walked out the glass doors into the pale morning light. She had a shower to take, a robe to put on, and a court to run. The morning sun clawed its way through the cheap vinyl blinds of Deputy Brock Hollister's apartment, casting harsh lines of light across his living room. He woke up feeling untouchable. He stretched his thick neck, a smug smile stretching across his face as he recalled the events of the previous night. Putting that mouthy, arrogant woman in her place at the Texaco station had been the highlight of his week. She thought she was so smart, quoting the Fourth Amendment like some bleeding heart public defender. Hollister chuckled to himself as he poured a mug of black coffee. He pulled out his phone and shot a quick text to his younger partner, Ellis Quinn. "Hope our favorite gas station lawyer is enjoying her concrete breakfast. See you at the courthouse." He did not know it yet, But that text message would eventually be entered into evidence across town in the sprawling, sunlit master bathroom of her gated estate. Judge Audra Voss was examining her wrists in the mirror. The angry red welts from the over-tightened steel cuffs had blossomed into ugly mottled purple bruises, wrapping around her skin like a brand of systemic failure. She ran a thumb over the tender flesh, her jaw set in stone. Her husband, Barrett, stood in the doorway, his eyes dark, with a mixture of profound worry and simmering litigious rage. "I can have the chief of police in my office by noon, Audra," Barrett said, adjusting his custom-tailored tie. "I can have those deputies suspended without pay before the sun goes down. You do not have to preside today. Let Judge Harrison take the docket. You were assaulted." Judge Voss turned away from the mirror and reached for the heavy velvet hanger holding her black judicial robe. "No, Barrett," she said, her voice eerily calm, possessing the dangerous stillness of a receding tide before a tsunami. "If I take the day off, they win the morning. They get to walk into a courtroom feeling like kings, believing their badges are blank checks for brutality. They are on my docket today for a motion to suppress evidence based on excessive force during a traffic stop. I need to see them. I need them to see me." She slipped her arms into the wide sleeves of the robe, the thick, dark fabric draped over her shoulders, completely concealing the purple bruises on her wrists. She looked into the mirror one last time. She was not the tired woman in the oversized hoodie anymore. She was the Honorable Judge Audra Voss, and she was going to war. The polished marble corridors of the Oakhaven County District Courthouse were buzzing with the chaotic symphony of the justice system. Lawyers in sharp suits whispered frantically with their clients. Families wept quietly on the wooden benches. Bailiffs barked orders. Hollister and Quinn strolled through the metal detectors with the arrogant swagger of men who believed the rules applied to everyone but them. They bypassed the civilian line, flashing their badges at the court officers, exchanging easy fist bumps and inside jokes. Quinn looked a little pale, sleep-deprived from the graveyard shift, but Hollister slapped him hard on the back. "Chin up, Ellis," Hollister sneered, adjusting his heavy utility belt. "Today is a breeze. This defense attorney, Stanfield, is a joke. He is trying to get his client's drug possession thrown out because we were a little rough pulling him out of the car. It is a standard Terry stop. The judge is going to rubber stamp it, and we will be at O'Malley's drinking cold beers by noon." "Who is the judge again?" Quinn asked nervously, checking his uniform tie. "We usually get Judge Harrison on Tuesdays." "Nah, Harrison is on vacation. We got Voss today," Hollister said dismissively, checking his reflection in the glass of a courtroom door. "She is a stickler for the rules, but she is pro-law enforcement. Just stick to the script." "We feared for our safety. The suspect was non-compliant. Standard escalation of force. Easy money." They met their police union representative, a slick, fast-talking lawyer named Blaine Peterson, outside the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302. Peterson checked his gold watch. "All right, boys, listen up," Peterson said, handing them each a copy of their sworn affidavit. "Judge Voss does not tolerate grandstanding. Answer the questions directly. Do not get defensive. We established that the defendant made a furtive movement justifying the physical extraction from the vehicle. Got it?" "We know the drill, Blaine," Hollister scoffed, rolling his eyes. "We are the good guys. Let us just get this over with." The deputies pushed through the swinging oak doors and strode down the center aisle of courtroom 302. They confidently took their seats in the front row directly behind the prosecution's table. They crossed their arms, whispering and chuckling, utterly blind to the catastrophic storm gathering just on the other side of the heavy wooden door behind the judge's bench. The door at the back of the gallery slammed open. Captain Dalton, the precinct commander, who had nearly passed out in the booking lobby earlier, burst into the courtroom. He was panting, his uniform disheveled, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated panic. He scanned the crowded room, his gaze locking onto Hollister and Quinn. Dalton started shoving his way past the wooden pews, ignoring the annoyed glares of the defense attorneys. He needed to get to his deputies before the gavel fell. He needed to pull them out of that room, but he was exactly too late. All rise. The booming, authoritative voice of Arthur, the veteran court bailiff, shattered the low murmur of the courtroom. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open. Every person in the room, the prosecutors, the defense attorneys, the defendants, and the gallery, stood in unison. Captain Dalton froze in the center aisle, his blood running entirely cold. He squeezed his eyes shut. It was over. The District Court of Oak Haven County is now in session, the Honorable Judge Audra Voss presiding. God save the state and this honorable court, Arthur bellowed. Judge Audra Voss ascended the steps to the bench. She moved with a terrifying predatory grace. The heavy black robe billowed slightly around her. She stood at the center of the elevated mahogany desk, looking out over her courtroom. Her expression was entirely unreadable, a mask of absolute judicial neutrality. "Be seated," she commanded. Her voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room. It was smooth, refined, and completely steady. In the front row, Deputy Brock Hollister sat down heavily, leaning back to get comfortable. He casually glanced up at the bench to size up the judge. The air in Hollister's lungs vanished. His brain completely short-circuited. He blinked once, twice. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the wooden railing in front of him so tightly his knuckles turned a stark bone white. It was her. The woman from the Texaco station. The woman in the oversized hoodie. The woman he had unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, mocked, handcuffed, and thrown into a freezing concrete holding cell just hours ago. She was not a nobody. She was not a suspected burglar. She was the chief magistrate of the very court he was currently sitting in. Next to him, Deputy Ellis Quinn made a sound that resembled a dying animal. A pathetic, high-pitched squeak escaped his throat. All the blood drained from Quinn's face, leaving him looking like a fresh corpse. He turned to Hollister, sheer, unadulterated terror vibrating through his entire body. "Brock," Quinn whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the word. "Brock, that is her." Hollister could not speak. He could not breathe. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on his face for the last hours melted away, replaced by the crushing, suffocating realization of his own doom. He looked toward the back of the room and saw Captain Dalton standing paralyzed in the aisle, glaring at them with a look of pure homicidal fury. Judge Voss did not look at them. Not yet. She sat down, adjusted her microphone, and opened the thick manila folder on her desk. She meticulously arranged her pens. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for agonizing seconds. To Hollister, it felt like years. "Good morning, counsel," Judge Voss finally said, looking down at the prosecutor, Claire Jenkins, and the defense attorney, Reed Stanfield. "We will begin today's docket with the evidentiary hearing on the motion to suppress in the matter of State versus Delgado. I understand we are examining the conduct and the standard operating procedures of the arresting officers." Judge Voss finally lifted her gaze. She did not just look at the deputies. She locked eyes with Brock Hollister. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to plummet. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no vindictiveness. There was only the cold, mechanical certainty of a trap snapping shut. "I see the arresting officers, Deputy Hollister and Deputy Quinn, are present," Judge Voss noted, her voice dripping with formal, icy courtesy. "Please step forward and take the witness stand, Deputy Hollister. Let us discuss your understanding of the law." Hollister's legs felt like lead. He stood up, his knees actually knocking together. He stumbled slightly as he pushed through the swinging gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court. He walked to the witness box, feeling the eyes of every single person in the room burning into his skin. He placed his hand on the Bible. His palm was sweating so profusely it left a damp print on the leather cover. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Arthur asked. "I do," Hollister stammered, his voice weak and raspy. He sat down. He was trapped in a wooden box, elevated just enough to be stared down upon by the woman he had shoved face first into the trunk of a car hours earlier. Defense attorney Reed Stanfield stood up, adjusting his glasses. Deputy Hollister, in your sworn affidavit, you stated that you forcefully extracted my client from his vehicle because he was disorderly and you suspected him of a crime. Could you explain to the court what specific articulable facts led you to that suspicion? Hollister swallowed hard. He looked at his union lawyer, Peterson, who nodded encouragingly, entirely oblivious to the nuclear bomb sitting on the bench. Hollister looked back at the judge. She was staring right through him. He was in a high-crime area, Hollister managed to croak out, and he refused to provide his identification immediately upon request. Judge Voss leaned forward. The entire courtroom leaned forward with her. Deputy Hollister, Judge Voss interrupted, her voice ringing out like a cracked whip. Are you asserting under oath in my courtroom that mere presence in an area, combined with a citizen's lawful invocation of their Fourth Amendment right not to identify themselves without reasonable suspicion, constitutes grounds for physical assault and arrest? Hollister started to sweat through his uniform shirt. No, Your Honor. I mean, he was resisting. Resisting what exactly? Judge Voss pressed, her tone surgical, precise, and lethal. Was he resisting a lawful order? Or was he resisting an unlawful escalation of power by an officer who felt his ego was bruised? Because the court finds it deeply troubling when officers manufacture resistance to justify an arrest that lacked probable cause from the very beginning. Every single word was a direct, targeted missile, hitting the exact events of the gas station encounter. The defense attorney, Stanfield, looked mildly surprised by the judge's aggressive line of questioning, but happily stepped back to let her dismantle the witness. We followed standard procedure, Your Honor, Hollister pleaded, his eyes darting frantically around the room, looking for an escape that did not exist. Standard procedure, Judge Voss repeated softly, letting the words hang in the heavy air. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her hands from beneath the bench. She placed them flat on the mahogany desk, right where the courtroom cameras and the deputies could see them. The sleeves of her black robe pulled back just enough to reveal the stark, ugly, dark purple bruises encircling both of her wrists. The color vanished entirely from the prosecutor's face. The union lawyer, Peterson, gasped audibly. A collective murmur of shock rippled through the gallery. Hollister stared at the bruises, his stomach dropping into an endless, terrifying abyss. Deputy Hollister, Judge Voss said, leaning in so close, her voice was a chilling whisper that carried to the very back of the room. I am extraordinarily familiar with your version of standard procedure, and today we are going to tear it apart piece by piece. The silence in courtroom 302 was absolute, thick enough to choke on. The only sound was the low, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning vents and the frantic, shallow breathing of Deputy Brock Hollister from the witness stand. He stared at the dark, blooming bruises on Judge Audra Voss's wrists. Those marks were his signature. They were the undeniable physical proof of his arrogance, now displayed under the unforgiving fluorescent lights of the justice system. Defense attorney Reed Stanfield, a seasoned veteran of the criminal courts, was sharp enough to realize instantly that the tectonic plates of this hearing had just shifted beneath his feet. He did not know the specifics, but he recognized the lethal glint in Judge Voss's eyes and the sheer, unadulterated panic radiating from the deputy. Stanfield wisely stepped back, yielding the floor to the bench. Let us continue, Deputy Hollister, Judge Voss said, her voice dropping to a conversational, yet terrifyingly precise register. She picked up a silver pen, turning it slowly between her fingers. You testified that your standard procedure involves escalating to physical force when a suspect is non-compliant with a demand for identification. Is that correct? Hollister gripped the edges of the wooden witness box. His knuckles were white. Yes, Your Honor, if we suspect a crime. Fascinating, Judge Voss mused, leaning back slightly in her high leather chair. Let us test the boundaries of that suspicion, shall we? I am a great believer in hypothetical scenarios to establish an officer's understanding of constitutional law. In the front row, Police Union Representative Blaine Peterson finally stopped reviewing his notes and looked up, a deep frown creasing his forehead. He leaned over to whisper to Deputy Ellis Quinn, but Quinn was completely unresponsive, staring straight ahead with the hollow eyes of a ghost. Hypothetically speaking, Deputy, Judge Voss continued, her gaze fixed entirely on Hollister, refusing to let him look away. Suppose a citizen is standing at a gas station. They are wearing a hooded sweatshirt. They are pumping gas into a silver sedan. They are entirely alone and not engaged in any observable illegal activity. Under your interpretation of the law, does this individual's mere presence justify an investigatory detention? Hollister's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. He looked desperately toward the prosecution table. Prosecutor Claire Jenkins, an incredibly sharp and usually aggressive attorney, was staring at the judge's bruised wrists, her eyes widening as the horrific puzzle pieces snapped together in her mind. Jenkins slowly lowered her pen to the table. She was not going to throw him a lifeline. She was watching the ship sink. "No, Your Honor," Hollister whispered, the microphone picking up the tremble in his voice. "Not just being there." "Excellent. We agree on the basic tenets of the Fourth Amendment," Judge Voss said, her tone dripping with a surgical, mocking politeness. "Now, let us advance this hypothetical. Suppose the officers approach the citizen and demand identification based on a vague, unsubstantiated claim of burglaries in the area. The citizen, knowing their rights, politely declines to provide identification as they are not suspected of a specific, articulable crime. Does this lawful refusal constitute resisting or disorderly conduct?" "Objection, Your Honor," Blaine Peterson suddenly called out from the gallery, abandoning courtroom decorum in a desperate bid to stop the slaughter. This hypothetical strays entirely from the facts of the current traffic stop. Judge Voss's head snapped toward Peterson. Her eyes flashed with a cold, terrifying authority that instantly silenced the room. "Mr. Peterson, you are here as union representation, not as counsel of record for this proceeding," Judge Voss stated, her voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "If you speak out of turn in my courtroom again, I will have Bailiff Arthur hold you in contempt and place you in a holding cell. I am intimately aware of what a holding cell feels like. Are you?" Peterson's jaw dropped. He slowly sank back into the wooden pew, completely neutralizing the only ally Hollister had left. Judge Voss turned her attention back to the sweating deputy on the stand. "Answer the question, Deputy Hollister. Does invoking a constitutional right constitute resisting?" "No, Your Honor," Hollister choked out. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, stinging his eye. He could not blink. He could not move. And yet, Judge Voss leaned forward, resting her forearms on the bench, the dark bruises fully visible again. If those hypothetical officers were to become enraged by this lawful refusal, if they were to violently grab the citizen, forcefully slam their face into the trunk of a vehicle, and apply handcuffs with such malicious force that it caused severe contusions, would that be considered standard procedure? Or would that be considered aggravated assault and a blatant deprivation of civil rights under color of law? The courtroom erupted into a flurry of whispered gasps. The defense attorney, Stanfield, audibly inhaled. The prosecutor, Claire Jenkins, physically pushed her chair away from her desk, creating distance between herself and the deputies. Hollister opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His chest heaved. The arrogant, untouchable sheriff's deputy, who had laughed in the precinct parking lot, was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified man, realizing he was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment. I, Hollister stammered. "Deputy Hollister, you are under oath," Judge Voss reminded him, her voice echoing with finality. "Are you capable of discerning the difference between lawful police work and armed thuggery? Because based on your sworn testimony today and your documented actions in the field, this court is finding it incredibly difficult to believe a single word that comes out of your mouth." In the front row, Deputy Ellis Quinn abruptly stood up. His chair screeched loudly against the polished hardwood floor. He was trembling violently, tears welling in his eyes. "Brock, sit down," Peterson hissed from beside him. "I cannot!" Quinn cried out, his voice cracking, panic overriding every ounce of his police training. He looked up at Judge Voss, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "Your Honor, please," I told him. I asked him if he was sure. I did not want to put the cuffs on you. I swear to God, he made me do it. Chaos descended upon courtroom 302. The chaotic symphony broke with the jarring, violent screech of Deputy Ellis Quinn's wooden chair dragging across the polished hardwood floor. Quinn had leapt to his feet, a man physically possessed by pure, unadulterated panic. He was trembling so violently that the heavy utility belt at his waist rattled. Tears, hot and unbidden, streamed down his flushed face, carving paths through the cold sweat of his terror. "Ellis, shut your mouth and sit down," hissed Blaine Peterson, the union representative. Peterson lunged forward, his manicured hands desperately grabbing at Quinn's uniform belt, trying to physically haul the young deputy back into his seat. But Quinn violently shoved Peterson's hands away. The structural integrity of his mind had completely collapsed under the crushing, monolithic weight of the perjury trap they had blindly walked into. He looked up at the bench, his hands raised in a frantic, pathetic gesture of surrender. "I cannot!" Quinn cried out, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wail that echoed off the high mahogany ceilings. "Your Honor, please." I told him. I asked him if he was sure in the parking lot. I did not want to put the cuffs on you. I swear to God, he made me do it. He said you were a nobody. Bailiff Arthur, a heavily built veteran of the courts, instinctively stepped forward, his right hand dropping smoothly to the grip of his holstered sidearm. The gallery behind the wooden railing erupted. Reporters, who had been half asleep during what they assumed was a routine suppression hearing, were now frantically scribbling on legal pads, their eyes wide with shock. Defense attorneys leaned over the wooden pews, whispering fiercely to one another, "Order in this court." The command did not come from Bailiff Arthur. It came from the bench. Judge Audra Voss did not raise her voice to a shout, nor did she reach for her wooden gavel. She simply projected her words with a cold, terrifying authority that sliced through the rising chaos like a freshly honed scalpel. She raised one hand, the dark, ugly purple bruising wrapping her wrist fully visible under the harsh fluorescent lights, and the entire room froze in absolute obedience. "Deputy Quinn," Judge Voss said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm, measured cadence. "You will remain exactly where you are. You do not speak unless spoken to. Furthermore, as an officer of this court, it is my duty to inform you that you are currently, spontaneously, and on the public record, admitting to participating in a felony. I highly suggest you exercise your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination immediately before you confess to anything else." Quinn's jaw trembled. He looked at Judge Voss, realizing that even after he had unlawfully assaulted her, she was still upholding his constitutional rights, rights that he and his partner had so casually stripped from her just hours prior. The profound difference between her integrity and his corruption broke whatever resolve he had left. Quinn collapsed heavily back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, terrified sobs. On the witness stand, Deputy Brock Hollister looked as though he had been struck by lightning. The arrogant, untouchable enforcer of the night shift was gone. He gripped the wooden railing of the witness box, his knuckles bone white, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was trapped in a glass cage of his own making, staring down at the very woman he had shoved face first into the trunk of a silver sedan. Prosecutor Claire Jenkins slowly pushed her chair away from the state's table. Jenkins was a notoriously aggressive prosecutor, but she was also a woman of uncompromising ethics who despised dirty cops because they poisoned the well of justice. She looked at Hollister on the stand, her expression twisting into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. Jenkins stood up, straightening her suit jacket. She looked up at the bench. "Your Honor," Jenkins began, her voice steady, ensuring the court reporter caught every single syllable for the official transcript. "The state relies on the integrity and the sworn testimony of law enforcement to pursue justice. In light of the devastating testimony just presented, the physical evidence currently visible on your Honor's wrists, and the spontaneous admission of guilt by Deputy Quinn, the state officially and unequivocally withdraws both deputies as credible witnesses." Jenkins turned slightly, glaring daggers at the sweating, gray-faced Hollister. Furthermore, the state will not be a party to a perjury trap set by its own law enforcement. We cannot, in good conscience, proceed with the prosecution of the defendant, Mr. Delgado, given that the entire foundation of his arrest relies solely on the poisoned word of these two individuals. Defense attorney Reed Stanfield did not miss a beat. He stood up instantly. The defense moves to dismiss all charges against my client with prejudice, Your Honor. The state joins in the motion to dismiss, Jenkins concurred sharply. Judge Voss looked down at the two lawyers, then shifted her gaze back to the ruined men in uniform. The motion is granted, Judge Voss ruled, her voice carrying the heavy, inescapable finality of a slamming vault door. The charges against the defendant are dismissed with prejudice. He is completely exonerated and free to go. Delgado, the young man sitting next to Stanfield, let out a massive, shuddering breath, dropping his head to the table as tears of profound relief spilled onto the wood. He had been facing years in a state penitentiary based entirely on Hollister's fabricated police report. But Judge Audra Voss was not finished. The judicial business regarding the traffic stop was concluded, but the true reckoning had just begun. Bailiff Arthur, Judge Voss commanded, her eyes locking onto the heavy brass-handled oak doors at the back of the courtroom. Please secure the main doors. Nobody leaves this room. Arthur moved with deliberate speed. He walked to the back of the gallery, grabbed the heavy brass deadbolts, and threw them. Clack, clack. The sharp metallic sound of the locks engaging echoed through the silent courtroom. To Brock Hollister, the sound was intimately, terrifyingly familiar. It sounded exactly like the heavy iron door of holding cell 3 slamming shut. He swallowed hard, a sickening wave of nausea washing over him. He was now the one detained. Before we officially recess, Judge Voss said, her tone shifting from the neutral referee of the court to the voice of absolute, impending justice. She addressed the entire gallery, but her eyes never, not even for a fraction of a second, left Brock Hollister. She slowly stood up from her high-backed leather chair. She did not step down from the elevated bench, making her physical presence towering and dominant. The heavy black fabric of her robe draped around her like an impenetrable shield. The power granted to law enforcement by the state is a sacred, heavy trust, Judge Voss declared, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity. It is the authority to strip a citizen of their liberty, their dignity, and in extreme cases, their life. When that power is wielded righteously, it is the bedrock of our society. But when that power is wielded, not to protect the public, but to stroke the fragile ego of a bully wearing a badge, it poisons the entire system. She held her bruised wrist up one final time, letting the ugly purple mark serve as the silent, undeniable exhibit of their crimes. Last night, under the cover of darkness, Deputy Hollister and Deputy Quinn engaged in an egregious, malicious abuse of power, Judge Voss continued, her gaze burning into Hollister's soul. They unlawfully detained, physically assaulted, and falsely arrested a woman simply because she knew her constitutional rights and refused to bow to their unlawful, ego-driven demands. They assumed she was powerless. They assumed she was a nobody who would simply take the abuse and fade away into the system. Judge Voss lowered her hands, resting them flat on the mahogany desk. But justice is not permanently blind to the abuses of those who swear to uphold it, she said softly, the silence in the room hanging on her every word. Justice merely waits for the light of day. And today, gentlemen, the light in this courtroom is blinding. Right on cue, a heavy authoritative knock echoed from the secured oak doors at the back of the room. Judge Voss gave a single sharp nod to her bailiff. Arthur unlocked the deadbolts and pulled the heavy doors open. 4 men in sharp dark suits strode purposefully down the center aisle. Leading the vanguard was Theo Brady, the chief investigator for the State Attorney General's Office of Internal Affairs. He was flanked by 2 heavily armed state troopers, their faces carved from stone. Trailing behind them, looking entirely defeated and pale, was Captain Dalton, the precinct commander, who had failed to control his rogue deputies. Hollister watched the men approach, his breath coming in shallow, hyperventilating gasps. The absolute reality of his situation crashed down upon him with the weight of an anvil. He was not just losing a suppression hearing. He was not just going to get a reprimand. He was losing his freedom. Chief Investigator Brady stopped at the swinging wooden gate separating the gallery from the well of the court. He held up a thick manila folder, looking up at the bench. "Judge Voss, with the court's permission," Brady asked formally. "Proceed, Investigator Brady," Judge Voss instructed, her face an unreadable, stoic mask. Brady pushed through the gate and walked directly to the witness stand. He did not look at Hollister with anger. He looked at him with a cold, absolute contempt reserved for dirty cops. "Deputy Brock Hollister," Brady stated, his voice loud enough to carry to the very back row. "You are hereby relieved of your duties, effective immediately, pending a criminal investigation by the State Attorney General's office and federal authorities. You are currently under investigation for violations of Title 18 United States Code, Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, falsifying official records, false arrest, and aggravated assault." Brady turned slightly, pointing a firm finger at the weeping deputy in the front row. "The exact same applies to you, Deputy Quinn." "No, please," Hollister whispered, his voice cracking, shedding the last remnants of his arrogant facade. He sounded like a frightened, cornered child. "Theo, come on. We know each other. I have a wife. I have a pension. It was just a misunderstanding. You should have thought of your family before you assaulted a citizen over a bruised ego," Brady replied, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "You have disgraced the uniform. Stand up. Place your hands flat on the railing." Trembling violently, his legs barely able to support his weight, Hollister stood up. Brady reached out and violently unpinned the silver Oak Haven County Sheriff's star from Hollister's chest. The sharp sound of the metal pin snapping free echoed loudly in the silent courtroom. Brady then systematically disarmed him. He unsnapped the holster, pulling the heavy Glock 19 duty weapon free, followed by the taser, the handcuffs, and the radio. Brady slammed the equipment onto the defense table. The heavy metallic clatter sounded like the closing of a coffin. In the front row, the two state troopers performed the exact same humiliating unburdening on Ellis Quinn. Stripped of their badges, their weapons, and their manufactured authority, Hollister and Quinn looked incredibly small. They were no longer the untouchable predators of the night shift. They were just two frightened criminal suspects, publicly humiliated and legally dismantled in front of their peers, the prosecution, and the very public they had sworn to serve. "Escort them out," Brady ordered the troopers, stepping back. The troopers grabbed Hollister and Quinn by the biceps, hauling them out of their seats. As the two disgraced, ruined men were marched down the long center aisle toward the heavy oak doors, Hollister stopped for a fraction of a second. He looked back over his shoulder, looking up at the towering mahogany bench one last time. Judge Audra Voss stood tall, her black robe pristine, her posture unyielding. She looked down at him, her expression entirely devoid of mercy. She had endured the darkness, the pain, and the humiliation of that freezing holding cell, specifically so she could bring the absolute light of justice to this very moment. Judge Voss picked up her wooden gavel. "This court is in recess," she declared. Bang! The sound of the heavy wooden gavel striking the sound block was louder than a gunshot. It echoed violently through the high-ceilinged courtroom. A definitive, crushing sound that would ring in the ears of the disgraced deputies long after the heavy oak doors closed behind them, sealing their fate forever. The fallout from courtroom 302 was not just a local scandal. It was a seismic event that shook the foundation of the state's law enforcement apparatus. By later that day, the story had leaked. News vans with extended satellite masts were parked nose to tail outside the Oak Haven County precinct. The public was hungry for a reckoning, and the state was forced to serve it up on a silver platter. The investigation, spearheaded by Chief Investigator Theo Brady and heavily supported by United States Attorney Marcus Vaughn, moved with a speed rarely seen in cases involving law enforcement. The precinct's attempt to sweep the incident under the rug crumbled instantly. The dashcam footage from Hollister's cruiser, which the night shift sergeant conveniently claimed had malfunctioned, was miraculously recovered by federal forensic technicians. The video was damning. It showed Judge Audra Voss standing peacefully at the Texaco pump, offering zero resistance, only to be violently slammed against the trunk of her car by a man desperate to assert dominance. Ellis Quinn, the younger deputy who had wept in the courtroom, broke completely during his first interrogation. Realizing he was facing federal prison time for depriving a citizen of their civil rights, Quinn flipped. He accepted a plea deal, agreeing to testify against Hollister and detail a long, documented history of Hollister routinely profiling and harassing minority drivers on the late shift. In exchange, Quinn was allowed to resign permanently from law enforcement, lost his pension, and was sentenced to years of heavily monitored probation. He would never wear a badge again. Brock Hollister, however, refused to go down quietly. His high-priced defense attorney, funded entirely by the most militant faction of the police union, tried to mount a defense based on qualified immunity and the stressful nature of police work. The attorney argued that Hollister made a split-second mistake in the dark, but there was no qualified immunity for malice. When the case went to federal trial, Brock Hollister sat at the defense table in a federal courthouse, wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit instead of his crisp, authoritative uniform. The arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by a sunken, hollow-eyed stare. He had lost his wife, his house, and his reputation. Now, he was fighting for his freedom. When Judge Audra Voss took the witness stand, the federal courtroom went dead silent. She was not wearing her black judicial robe this time. She wore a tailored navy blue suit. She did not need the robe to command the room. Her testimony was a master class in precision. She did not embellish. She did not show anger. She simply laid out the cold, indisputable facts of the assault, explaining the legal thresholds Hollister had willfully ignored. Every word she spoke was a nail in his coffin. Federal Judge Valeria Ross, a woman known for her zero-tolerance policy on police corruption, presided over the trial. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, including aggravated assault and felony deprivation of rights under color of law, Hollister finally broke, burying his face in his hands as his attorney awkwardly patted his shoulder. And during sentencing, Judge Ross looked down at Hollister with absolute disdain. "Mr. Hollister, you were given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable," Judge Ross stated, her voice echoing through the silent room. "Instead, you used them as tools of intimidation. You arrested a woman because you believed she was a nobody who could not fight back. You were wrong, and your arrogance has cost you everything. The fact that your victim happened to be a sitting judge was merely the cosmic justice required to expose your corruption." The gavel fell. Brock Hollister was sentenced to years in federal prison. The hard karma did not end there. Because of his background in law enforcement, Hollister could not be placed in a minimum security white-collar facility. He was sent to a medium-security federal penitentiary, where he would spend the next years looking over his shoulder, experiencing the very same loss of liberty and constant gnawing fear he had so casually inflicted on others. As for Judge Audra Voss, she returned to her bench the very next week. She did not let the trauma of that night define her. Instead, she weaponized it for good. She became a leading voice in the state for criminal justice reform, mandating stricter body camera compliance for all county officers, and establishing a civilian oversight board for the Oak Haven precinct. She had always been a fair judge, but after that night in the cold, concrete holding cell, her understanding of the power dynamic between the state and the citizen was profoundly sharpened. She knew exactly what it felt like to be powerless, and she vowed that as long as she wore the black robe, no one in her courtroom would ever be subjected to that kind of tyranny again. Justice had been blind, but on that fateful morning, she took off her blindfold and looked corruption right in the eye. The arrogance of Brock Hollister blinded him to the reality that power does not always wear a uniform, and justice does not always announce itself before it strikes. Judge Voss endured a terrifying night in a cold cell to expose the rot in that precinct, turning a personal nightmare into a master class in accountability. This true-to-life drama proves that absolute karma does not just happen. Sometimes it sits on the bench and wields a gavel.